So in this screencast, we're going to cover sections 4.3 and 4.4. And it's really important that you listen carefully to what I would expect you to know, because there are some very, very complicated sections of this. And for this course, we're not going to go into the molecular level of these processes. So we're going to be looking at the 3 stages of cell respiration. We're going to give an overview of glycolysis. And that's all of this is happening when the glucose comes into the cell. We're going to look at why glycolysis probably evolved before other aerobic respiration. We're going to look at the mitochondria, and we're going to look at steps of the Krebs cycle, but again, not in as much detail. So let's get started. So here we have that equation for cell respiration that we looked at before. Glucose is coming in, C6H12O6, with oxygen, and we are getting carbon dioxide as a waste product. We're getting some water as a waste product, but we're making a lot of ATPs. Now take a look at the 3 stages. Now I do want you to know the names of the 3 stages. In stage 1, we have something called glycolysis. So here's our glucose molecule, 1 glucose molecule. It has 6 carbons. It's being split in half, and it's going to make for us 2 ATPs. So when glucose is split in half, after it gets split in half, it goes to stage 2. It goes into what's called the Krebs cycle. And at the Krebs cycle, we're going to be creating more ATP, 2 more. And then finally, the 3rd stage is oxidative phosphorylation. That's where the oxygen really comes into play. So I don't want you to memorize this diagram, but what I do want you to do is know the 3 stages. Glycolysis in stage 1, or step 1. The Krebs cycle in stage 2, and oxidative phosphorylation in stage 3. So here's the first step in glycolysis. Here's our 6-carbon glucose. This is the way biologists show this. It's being split and into 2 molecules of C3. And it only makes 2 ATPs. Now, let's take a look at what's called anaerobic and aerobic respiration. So later on in our course, we're going to talk about evolution, and we're going to talk about how long life has been on the planet and looking at different fossils, and it's really interesting. But for right now, we're talking about cell respiration. Scientists think that glycolysis, the first step of cell respiration, evolved before the other parts, the other 2 stages, stage 1 or stage 2 and 3, excuse me. Why would they think that? This is because you don't need any oxygen at all for glycolysis to work. And billions of years ago, there was no oxygen in the Earth's atmosphere. That didn't start to evolve until 4 billion years ago. So any process that makes energy that doesn't use oxygen is called anaerobic respiration. If you need oxygen in that process, that's referred to as aerobic. So make sure you read this carefully and understand the difference between the 2. Okay, let's take a look at a mitochondria. This is 1. Mitochondria is plural, mitochondrion is 1. So here is 1 mitochondrion, and this is where cell respiration takes place. And this is the structure which is defined by an inner, that's this yellowish, and outer, that's this brownish red membrane. It plays an important role. And this is where glycolysis takes place, and the other 2 steps of cell respiration take place. So the Krebs cycle is when we take that, sometimes called the citric acid cycle, and this is the process by which the glucose is ripped apart even more to make more ATP. That's energy for the cell. I don't want you to have to know, don't memorize all of these diagrams, just know that the second phase of cell respiration is called the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle. And then the big energy is the movement of electrons. Electron chains move during this last stage of cell respiration. And so all I'd like you to know is that it's the movement of electrons which helps create those ATP energy-rich molecules. You don't have to understand all of this molecular-based cell respiration. A diagram that I found that I really liked is this one, and this is showing you, here's a mitochondria, okay, and it says stage 1, glycolysis, okay, so the glucose is ripped in half. Stage 2, the Krebs cycle, which is where we take in carbon dioxide and we make some ATP out of here, and then finally the electron transport chain, or the phosphorylation, as your text calls it, makes the rest of the ATP. So and all of this happens in the mitochondria. So this diagram, I might ask a couple questions from this. So please take a look at this carefully. Finally, our last section in chapter 4 is called anaerobic respiration. So this is respiration that life, different forms of life, you can do it, takes place in making a little bit of energy without oxygen. See, when you make energy without oxygen, you don't make that many ATPs. But when cell respiration uses oxygen, you can make a lot more. So take a look at the lesson objectives here. We're looking at fermentation. We're going to describe lactic acid fermentation. That's what happens in your muscles when you run out of oxygen in your muscles. And alcoholic fermentation. That's the fermentation that yeast do for beer and wine. And we're going to look at the advantages and disadvantages of both. So here's a simple diagram on lactic acid fermentation. And this happens in your muscles when we run out of when we run out of oxygen. So take a look at this. Know that lactic acid fermentation, the reason your muscles hurt when you exercise a whole lot is we don't like lactic acid that much in our cells, especially our muscle cells. Here's alcoholic fermentation. This is done by yeast and some other organisms when they break down glucose. So make sure you read the differences between aerobic and anaerobic respiration. It's really important to know that right now in our atmosphere we have about 21% oxygen, but billions of years ago there was no free oxygen on the planet. So look at the advantages of aerobic. They'll tell you about that, getting a lot more energy. As a matter of fact, we get 38 ATPs out of 1 molecule of glucose, whereas anaerobic we're only getting 2, so a lot less. So go over the lesson summary here. They'll talk about fermentation, they'll talk about lactic acid and alcoholic fermentation, and the advantages and disadvantages of both. So that ends chapter 4. Please make sure you read the chapter, you take notes on it, and watch the screencast a couple times if you're unsure of anything. Remember, we'll not go into a lot of detail on the cell respiration or the photosynthesis at a molecular level. Just at a conceptual level, we'll ask those questions. Good luck.